Hello. In this video, I'm going to give a brief overview to the circulatory system and then talk about blood. So the circulatory system is composed of the heart, the blood vessels, and your blood. And to compare it to the cardiovascular system technically is just the heart and blood vessels. So the heart is an organ that pumps our blood, and the blood vessels are the organs that allow blood to circulate to most places in the body. Functions of the circulatory system include delivering oxygen and nutrients like glucose and amino acids, and hormones, which are chemical messengers, delivering those things to the cells and tissues of the body. The circulatory system also removes wastes from the cells and tissues of the body, such as carbon dioxide, heat, and other waste products. And the circulatory system carries our white blood cells, which are important for defense, and antibodies, which also are important for defense. So blood is considered a connective tissue, and like most connective tissues, it has an important cell component and an important matrix component. The cells of blood are referred to as formed elements, and the formed elements of blood include erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells, leukocytes, also known as white blood cells, and platelets. The extracellular matrix of blood is called plasma. It's mostly made of water, but it does have some stuff dissolved in it. If we take blood and centrifuge it in a tube, we get what's called a hematocrit. A hematocrit is the percent of blood that is red blood cells. So normally, the percent of blood that is red blood cells is about 45%. So down at the bottom of the screen here, we can see a tube. And what's happened here is after centrifugation, the red blood cells are pushed to the bottom of the tube. And they comprise about 45% of what's in the blood. Just at the top of the erythrocytes, there's a small area it's kind of whitish in color. We call this the buffy coat. And the buffy coat contains leukocytes and platelets. But the remaining 55% or so of the blood is plasma, which is at the top of the centrifuge tube. So let's take a closer look at blood plasma. As I mentioned, blood plasma is mostly water. About 90% of it is water. But then there's stuff that's dissolved in the water, like nutrients, like glucose, one of the most important nutrients. And there are vitamins and amino acids, which are other nutrients that we find in blood plasma. Something else in the plasma that we're going to find are electrolytes, which we might also call ions. And these include things in our food like sodium ions, potassium ions, and calcium ions. There are some respiratory gases dissolved in blood plasma, such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. So even though there is some oxygen dissolved in blood plasma, most of the oxygen carried in your blood is actually attached to proteins inside of your red blood cells. We'll also find hormones in the bloodstream. So hormones are chemical messengers, and they're carrying a message to the cells of the body. So examples of hormones that you might find in the bloodstream include insulin, which sends a message to your cells telling your cells that it's okay to take glucose out of the bloodstream. Another example of a hormone you might find in the blood is thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone comes from your thyroid gland in your neck, and it goes to many cells of your body, and it tells them to go ahead and make ATP energy. We'll also find plasma proteins in our blood plasma, and there are different types of blood plasma proteins. The most common type is called albumin, and albumin is a really important protein for regulating water balance in the body. We'll talk more about this when we talk about what happens in capillaries, which are the tiniest blood vessels in the body. Clotting proteins are also found in blood plasma, and these are important for preventing blood loss when a blood vessel is broken. And then antibodies are an important type of protein in the bloodstream. And antibodies are our defensive proteins that can do things like kill pathogens and viruses. We also find waste products in our blood plasma. So this could include something like urea, which is a waste product that we produce when we use proteins for energy. And last on the list here are buffers. Buffers are molecules that can take in or release hydrogen ions as necessary in order to maintain a pH. So buffers are really important for making sure that the pH doesn't deviate very far in the bloodstream. And the pH in the bloodstream has to remain between 7.35 and 7.45. And if we deviate from that for an extended period of time, death can occur. An example of a buffer we find in the bloodstream is something called bicarbonate. And bicarbonate helps to prevent the conditions of acidosis and alkalosis. Acidosis is when the blood becomes too acidic. Alkalosis is when the blood becomes too alkaline. And these things can occur due to foods we consume, problems with metabolism, problems with respiration, and problems with our kidneys. Now let's take a look at the formed elements of blood. So we have erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. Erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells, are really important for carrying oxygen. And these are sort of unusual cells. Basically, they have no organelles inside of them. During their maturation process, they eject all of their organelles so that what we have inside of the red blood cell is really nothing but a protein called hemoglobin. So there'll be millions of these hemoglobin proteins inside of a single red blood cell. And the hemoglobin protein is important because it's what carries the oxygen. Hemoglobin protein contains iron. And iron is the part that actually is capable of binding to oxygen. And it binds to oxygen reversibly. What that means is that when your blood is in your lungs, the iron will help to bind to the oxygen in the lungs. But then once that blood is delivered to an oxygen deficient tissue, then the oxygen can leave the iron and go to the cells that need it. Leukocytes are the white blood cells, and they're very important for the body's defense because they can do things like kill parasites like worms, and they can kill bacteria and virally infected cells and even cancer cells. White blood cells are found in places besides the bloodstream. They're capable of actually leaving the bloodstream. And this is important because sometimes we have infections where there isn't blood, and so these white blood cells need to leave the bloodstream for that. They're less abundant than the red blood cells. By far, most of what we find in terms of formed elements in the bloodstream are the red blood cells. Last up are the platelets, which are important for blood clotting, which is also called hemostasis. So here's a picture showing the different types of formed elements in blood. So this is something called a blood smear. It's a slide of blood. And most of the cells that we see here are erythrocytes. And erythrocytes have sort of an unusual shape. They look like a donut, but they don't really have a hole in the middle. It just looks that way in some of these viewpoints. And then we have white blood cells such as lymphocytes and neutrophils. And then the tiny little purple splotches all over the place are the platelets, which are important for blood clotting. Hematopoiesis is the term we use to describe the production of blood cells. Hematopoiesis is a process that occurs in our red bone marrow. And hematopoiesis is made possible by the presence of stem cells in the red bone marrow. These stem cells are called hematopoietic stem cells, and they're capable of differentiating into any blood cell type. So the hematopoietic stem cell can turn into any of the white blood cell types like neutrophils and lymphocytes and macrophages, and the hematopoietic stem cell can turn into both red blood cells and platelets too. A lot of what's happening in the bone marrow is the production of red blood cells. And that's because most of the cells in our blood are red blood cells. And also, the red blood cells don't last very long. They only live for about 100 to 120 days. And the red blood cells are removed from the bloodstream by the spleen. So the spleen is said to be the red blood cell graveyard of the body. The red blood cell components are recycled and sent to places like the liver for disposal. So the protein hemoglobin, parts of that will be sent to the liver and turned into something called bilirubin. And then bilirubin is put into bile, and bile is something that's squirted into our intestines. And then basically this ends up in our fecal matter and it's removed from the body. Other components to the hemoglobin protein can be reused, and those components are sent to the bone marrow for reuse. For example, like iron can be reused and sent to the bone marrow. The rate of red blood cell production is controlled by a hormone called erythropoietin. So erythropoietin is also known as EPO, and you might have heard of this because this is often talked about like with the Olympics. So this can be used as a hormone enhancer. So basically, sometimes people will use artificial erythropoietin to increase the number of red blood cells in their bloodstream so that they can carry more oxygen and be more efficient athletes. But your body makes its own erythropoietin, and this is made in your kidneys. So the kidneys produce most of the erythropoietin, and they do this in response usually to low blood oxygen levels. So when you are experiencing hypoxia, low blood oxygen levels, this stimulates the release of EPO, which travels to your bone marrow and then stimulates the hematopoietic stem cells there to make lots of red blood cells so that you can carry more oxygen and you're no longer hypoxic. You now have normal oxygen levels in your bloodstream. The next thing I want to talk about is hemostasis, or what you commonly refer to as blood clotting. So basically, this is the stopping of bleeding resulting from a break in a blood vessel. So when you break a blood vessel wall, bleeding occurs. And it takes a really long time for the blood vessel wall to repair. So we kind of need to put a plug in that leak until we can get the blood vessel wall repaired. And this plug is the blood clot. So hemostasis has some different steps to it. The initial part of hemostasis involves platelets sticking to each other, forming what we call platelet plug. Now, normally platelets don't stick to each other in the bloodstream. Platelets only like to stick to kind of rough edges. So when you have a break in the blood vessel wall, there's going to be some rough edges there, and platelets will stick there, and then other platelets will stick to those platelets, forming this plug. Next, what happens is a protein in the blood plasma becomes activated. So this protein is called fibrinogen, and normally fibrinogen does nothing in your bloodstream. However, if you have a broken blood vessel wall, the fibrinogen becomes activated into something called fibrin. And fibrin is a very sticky protein that forms a sticky network that is going to stick to the broken blood vessel wall, and it's going to trap in blood cells and platelets, forming what we call the blood clot. The clot will remain until the blood vessel wall can be repaired, and then once that is complete, the blood clot will then be broken down, and we're back to a nice fresh blood vessel wall. Now let's talk about some abnormalities involving the formed elements. So starting with the erythrocytes, there's a condition called anemia, which is a decrease in the oxygen carrying ability of the blood. One common form of anemia is called sickle cell anemia, which is actually a genetic disorder that results in red blood cells having an abnormal sickle shape. So the sickle shape is sort of like a crescent shape. So what's happening here is the hemoglobin protein is not being made properly, and it causes the whole entire red blood cell to have the wrong shape. And these sickled red blood cells don't flow nicely through the bloodstream, and they get clogged in tiny blood vessels. This is a very painful disorder, and it can be very damaging to the kidneys and blood vessel walls. Polycythemia, poly means many. Polycythemia is an excess amount of erythrocytes. Now let's take a look at homeostatic imbalances involving the leukocytes. Leukocytosis is an excessive number of leukocytes, and this is very common during an infection, which makes sense because if you have some sort of infection, you're going to have a higher white blood cell count so that you can combat the pathogen. Leukopenia is a low leukocyte count. Penia means poverty, so this is a poverty of leukocytes. So this is often caused by different types of drugs like steroids and anti-cancer agents. People with leukopenia have to be very careful of being exposed to pathogens because they're at increased risk for infection. And then we have leukemia. Leukemia is a type of cancer of the leukocytes. These individuals have excess amounts of leukocytes, but they're malformed leukocytes that aren't functioning properly. Now let's talk about some abnormalities involving clotting. So most of the time, we don't have any breaks on our blood vessel walls, and so most of the time we're not forming clots. But occasionally, undesired clotting occurs. This can happen with certain heart conditions like atrial fibrillation, or when we form plaque on the walls of our arteries, which we call atherosclerosis. High blood pressure can also encourage undesired clotting. A thrombus is a clot that has formed inside of a blood vessel when it shouldn't have. And if a clot should form in the arteries feeding the heart or the brain, this can be very dangerous because it can cause a heart attack or a stroke. If a clot breaks away and then travels to a smaller blood vessel and gets stuck somewhere else, we call that an embolus. So an embolus is basically a thrombus that has traveled. And again, this can be very dangerous because if the embolus gets stuck in the tiny blood vessels leading to like the brain or the heart, it can cause a heart attack or stroke. Related are some bleeding disorders. So bleeding disorders are also abnormalities involving the blood. So you might be familiar with the bleeding disorder called hemophilia. Normally, hemophilia is a hereditary bleeding disorder. So this is a thing that's caused by damaged or mutated genes that are passed on from parent to offspring. In these conditions, certain molecules that are required for clotting are missing, and so these individuals are unable to clot their blood when they have a break in the blood vessel wall.